Morning, everyone, and welcome to this NLA Breakfast. And we're going to be looking at the retail and hospitality programme of the NLA. And this is an area we feel is really important at the moment when we need to support this very distressed part of our economy as a result of COVID-19. So after a long break, this is the first NLA Breakfast Talk. So we're very pleased to get it back on the programme again, and we'll be doing more in the new year. And after such a challenging year, we're delighted to present today plans to refresh and update London's historic Regent Street and the vision for a greener, healthier and more sustainable West End. But before we start, I'd just like to remind you that there will be a Q&A at the end, so you can post your questions using the Q&A button. And also right at the end, we'll have a little poll just to see how you've enjoyed this morning's event. And it'd be very helpful if you filled that out. It really is good for making sure we're producing the right sort of programme. And I'd also like to thank our programme champions, New West End Company and Axiom Architects. Now, our first speaker is Scott Marshall. He's head of public realm and urban infrastructure at the Crown Estate, and he's going to introduce the project. So, Scott, over to you.
Many thanks, Peter. And Peter, thank you very much for your introduction and kindly inviting us to join this morning with the NLA and the viewers. Timely and appreciated. Good morning, everybody. And first slide, please, if that's possible. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to share with you a small step in our ongoing investment in Regent Street. Sorry, that's the wrong slide. Can I just, that one, thank you, sorry. My name's Scott Marshall. I'm head of public realm and urban infrastructure at the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate is a business with a distinct heritage and a unique portfolio. It includes some of central London's best places to work, shop and experience, regional retail and leisure destinations, and a substantial regional rural portfolio. We manage the seabed and half the foreshore around England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and therefore play a fundamental role in the sustainable development of this national asset, including the UK's world-leading offshore wind sector. We are the custodians of Windsor Estate, including the world-renowned Windsor Great Park. Established by an Act of Parliament as an independent commercial business, we are tasked with generating profit for the Treasury for the benefit of the nation's finances. This has totaled 2.9 billion over the last 10 years. In the last month, we committed to achieving net zero carbon by 2030 in response to the climate emergency. It's great to have this opportunity to join the NLA today the last session of 2020 and share with you this exciting and innovative project, a project to transform the public realm of Regent Street and Regent Street St James's as part of our contribution to supporting the recovery of not just the West End, but also London and the UK. Many of you may already have seen the press and media coverage and perhaps on LinkedIn and other channels from our mid-October announcement. Today, I'm not going to repeat those words, but rather give you a bit of background to the story, this background story to the project. Next slide, please. I'm not sure about you, but I'll never forget, or I won't easily forget, the stark challenge of the images of the empty Piccadilly Circus shown each evening on the news early in lockdown. A place that was so typically full of life, so empty of people. Being so familiar with this thriving and bustling place over many years, this was hard hitting. It's hard hitting to all of us, so confronting, so bleak. And I think these images impressed the severity of the pandemic on all of us. It also presented such an enormous challenge to us, as many colleagues were focused on responding to the crisis. My role required me to ask the question, how on earth do we get the incredible ecosystem of our capital city going again and the West End? And can we at the Crown Estate, with our partners, play a part in that story? Footfall is the lifeblood of our customers. Within 3 weeks of lockdown, footfall had fallen off the edge of a cliff. Daily footfall had reduced to less than 5% of normal levels, to well under 200,000 people movements per week, down from an average of about 1.6 million movements per week. Regent Street typically sees 80 million visits per year, and this was really well down. And so what did we do? How were we going to help recovery of this important part of the West End at such a challenging time when people being close to one another is incredibly challenging? Some wise advice early on was to keep talking regularly to those around us. And we heard that. And so we started to build on and develop those key networks that would be instrumental in bringing about solutions as yet unidentified, because this was new ground, but we set up these groups so that we could work well together. And we had the networks in place to respond to the emerging crisis that we were all facing. We set up external working groups and internal working groups within Crown Estate. And those working groups were with Westminster City Council and our neighbouring landowners, business improvement districts, Transport for London. And we knew that these relationships would be essential to recovery and sharing of information so that we could move forward. These groups are still in place and will be instrumental as we continue along this journey. A real highlight during this period has been this collaboration, a real silver lining to the challenges that we've been facing. The fact that we're all in this together, and we still are. But we could share our learnings, we could share data, we could share evidence and our experiences with the primary goal of public safety, and then when we could, getting the West End and the city going again. And we were learning as we went. We were creating new best practice as we went along. Footfall analysis and pedestrian modelling took on a whole new perspective at 2 metre and then 2 metre and 1 metre plus throughout the old rule book. And you know, how could we arrange queues in the public highway when we had never really had to think too much about that in the past? And with public transport so challenged, how could we open up options for safe movement around the city? Next slide, please. We worked very closely with Westminster City Council on their movement strategy, becoming a trusted partner, which led to the timely and helpful introduction of these green barriers that you can see here. This was at the end of May, as we were celebrating our NHS heroes, so you'll remember the time. However, we saw these measures that they could only be a short-term solution, and they would need to be replaced by something that would meet the crucial contemporary needs of today in this pandemic, whilst also respecting that incredibly important heritage, that built fabric that we know so well. We knew we needed to innovate and do our part to build back better for all of those that rely on us, our neighbours, our community and our customers. One thing that was clear, many were looking to us and our partners at this time to provide reassurance and leadership for the West End and for London. And we knew we must do more to promote our destination and our customers beyond the initial recovery challenges of public safety and 2 metre social distancing. Next slide, please. Thank you. Could we elevate Regent Street and St James's as a big move for London's recovery? How could we further support our retailers and office customers? Could it have a fresh look and feel? How could we enable a greener recovery? Could we help people feel better with a great first impression when we were able to welcome people back? Could we make the area more accessible and put accessibility at the heart of the project? And could we use this as an opportunity to advance our public realm strategy and support policy aims of Westminster City Council and the Mayor in key areas of accessibility, air quality, climate, carbon and safety? We thought so, but we didn't have 3 to 5 years, which is how long these things typically would take with a fair wind. But we'd already seen some examples of how London could do this quickly and cost effectively, perhaps. We've been looking to others and learning from them. And we had examples, great examples from the 2012 Olympics to draw from, and specifically the road user priority measures that were brought forward at that time. And could we adapt these to apply sensitively to Regent Street? The headline brief was simple: enable COVID-19 recovery, contemporary city needs, has to be an economic introduction of a scheme implemented really quickly, and people had to be first and foremost in their safer movement. And then road users would hopefully be able to all fall into line. Next slide, please. And here's our solution. It creates over 5,000 square meters of new footway, and that's a staggering amount of additional footway in such a complex centre and destination such as this. I don't know about you, but it had the street had almost a dual carriageway running through it, and this scheme removes those 2 extra lanes, leaving just 2 lanes. And this is the first time Regent Street has not had this for many decades, perhaps even since Nash originally laid out the street. The scheme includes cycle lanes for the first time, and the scheme provides over 150 cycle parking spaces additionally to what were already there. Significant greening, 322 planters, 62 trees, There are 16 different species, and the approach to the design, and BDP will come on to that shortly, and that's over to Nick, but effectively a linear arboretum was the approach to providing that greening and building on some of our work with partners on Wild West End and bringing that green ribbon through our portfolio. And so this is the scheme, and it's been implemented on a trial basis. It's an 18-month experimental trial using experimental traffic order provisions to enable this scheme to proceed at the pace that it was necessary. And at the end of the trial, it'll be either made permanent, it'll be replaced by a better scheme, or it'll be removed. And it's one of the few measures, one of the few COVID schemes that's been comprehensively traffic modelled to justify the scheme. And the project was approved by Westminster and TfL unanimously earlier in the year. Next slide, please. And here's another before, just to help from a street level view in May. And next slide, please. And here's after. Just to give an impression of the look and feel at that street level. And Nick will probably include some photos later that shows that in its current state, having already implemented elements of the scheme. This isn't just a footway widening screen. Sorry, excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water. This isn't just a footway widening scheme and a greening scheme. It's a great opportunity for us to continue to explore new ways of working with stakeholders. We're in a new era now that normal is not, new normal is very different to the old normal. And we want to challenge ourselves with how the spaces between our buildings are used, what are they for, and how can they work harder, and how can we make the ground floor uses work harder with the spaces outside the building in the public realm. We want to trial digital innovation as part of this scheme, and also we are capturing live monitoring data, air quality, traffic flows, footfall, amongst other things, to help us actually look after and maintain the scheme in a smart way. But perhaps most importantly, we're using this time to develop the brief for what the post-COVID Regent Street should look like. Perhaps 2022, late 2022, 2023 and beyond. What is Regent Street for? What should it be in this post-COVID world? And so next slide, please. Where are we now? We've been making some startling progress with this project with the help of the various teams. Phase one, which is all the way from Regent Street, all the way from All Souls in the north down to the Quadrant, just north of Piccadilly Circus. This is practically complete, with only some weather-dependent items to be completed as soon as we get a pause in the weather. And then phase two will be Piccadilly Circus down towards Waterloo Place, and that will be started in January and complete, we trust, by the end of February. And here we are on our first traffic-free day, which coincided with Small Business Saturday, immediately after lockdown 2. And it was great to see, and a real privilege, that this project was officially opened by the Lord Mayor of Westminster as he completed the final planting in the planter here, alongside the leader of Westminster City Council, Councillor Robertson, Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, and our own James Cooksey, Director, Central London. And so, just to say, you know, that typically a project like this would take 3 to 5 years to bring through and bring to fruition. But the pace of this project has been absolutely phenomenal. This has all been done within a matter of weeks. And it couldn't have been done without the huge commitment and the partnership and collaboration that we have seen people draw from reserves as required at a time like this to take the opportunity to get, you know, the West End going and get Regent Street as it needs to be to face the future needs of the city, and particularly in the immediate terms, and as we believe it will as we look to the longer term. And I'd like to take this opportunity to publicly thank our partners at Westminster City Council and Transport for London and the West End Company and Heart of London Business Alliance. There's been a true spirit of real partnership as a real golden thread through all of the all of the work that has gone on to enable this to happen. And we've had some incredible experts and professional advisors, Jones Lang LaSalle, Atkins, BDP, Norman Walk Prime, Gardner and Theobald, and FM Conway constructing the scheme for us. And it's been a real sort of coming together of experts and doing things in a totally new and innovative way, which we've never had to do a scheme like this before at such scale. And I just want to thank them for their dedication and commitment to achieving this significant step forward in the West End's recovery, and if not London. And now, just before I hand back to Peter with this last slide, if you could, thank you. Here is an image of one of our new evergreen trees as a sign of what's to come. Many of our 62 trees are deciduous and currently dormant and acting as a subtle backdrop to the spectacular Christmas lights. However, as we emerge from the pandemic, and it's great that this photo was taken on a sunny day, as we emerge from the pandemic in this winter, spring is just around the corner. And with that, we will have new shoots and blossom to go hand in hand with vaccines, all promising a new year that should be filled with hope and greater footfall returning. And with that, happier customers and a vibrant street once again. Next slide, please. And here's the spirits we just to see. And thank you, and do enjoy the break. I'll hand back to Peter. Many thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Scott. And now I'd like to introduce Nick Edwards, and Nick is Chair of Landscape Architecture at BDP, who's going to look at some of the key design elements of the project. Nick.
Thank you, Peter. In the autumn, actually, next slide. In the autumn, Regent Street was benefiting from the provision of the temporary barriers Scott showed in his slides. And whilst these were helping with social distancing, they were making it difficult for people to cross the street. They were challenging for taxis, deliveries, refuse collection. They provided limited visibility, particularly difficult at junctions. They created pinch points, and they'd often hem cyclists between the barriers and passing vehicles. Next slide. In addition to the need to facilitate social distancing, we kind of all recognise that we have a responsibility to try and do what we can to address global environmental challenges, that there's a need to support active travel. There's also a need to enhance user experience and encourage people to return to all of our high streets. This is a sort of pinnacle, but it's relevant to all. Whilst this image is Oxford Circus in 2018, the year when we all discovered a certain Greta Thunberg, the challenge hasn't gone away, and the pandemic has actually only reinforced our understanding through those rare sights of blue sky, birdsong interrupting Zoom meetings, and increased appreciation of our gardens, parks, and nature in its widest sense. Next slide. Linked to this reawakening is our desire to support initiatives including Westminster's Wild West End, and to do this through the incorporation of planting and the promotion of biodiversity and ecological connectivity. Aside from enriching user experience and making wayfinding more intuitive, the incorporation of planting will also help us to improve air quality and just generally support our psychological well-being. Next. The approach taken is regenerative in nature with, I suppose, three simple themes. We want to restore pedestrian confidence through the provision of a perceptively safe place. We want to reallocate space in a way that places pedestrians at the top of modal hierarchy. And we've sought to revitalise by incorporating nature, facilitating social activity, and providing space for people to step back from the flow and find a place to dwell or take refuge. Next, please. Amongst the various lessons we learned from the use of barriers was that the carriageway could operate reasonably well. This was modelled very intensively at a reduced width, and that pedestrians are not particularly comfortable in using the relatively narrow and corralled strips at carriageway level. For the space that was gained, it wasn't being used as well as it might. Next. Traffic modelling by NRP and Atkins, collaboration with Westminster and TfL, has demonstrated that we're able to reallocate approximately 4 metres of carriageway to enhance the pedestrian environment, provide space for cyclists, and accommodate the requirements of buses, taxis, servicing private cars. Studies have also demonstrated that planting can be accommodated in coordination with existing pavement obstructions and features and there's scope to provide an arrangement that supports social distancing, barrier-free pedestrian movement, space for queuing, there's lots of that with the shops, and the personalisation of entrances, and space for activities and events along the street. Next, please. Having agreed broad parameters on how we might organise movement channels and green infrastructure, we went through a process of assessing design approaches, including the use of adaptation of off-the-shelf planters, gabion cages, formwork for piling, recycled felt bags, anything we could do quick, before we finally settled on a more bespoke approach themed around nature and strengthening the connections between Portland Place to the north and Waterloo Place to the south. Next, please. We wanted an approach that would be characteristically distinct to Regent Street, an approach that could be adjusted to suit varying contexts and a broad range of constraints, including need for clear sight lines, the varying gradients that exist, weight constraints with basements, and extensive utility access requirements. We wanted modules that would be reasonably aerodynamic in form and that would facilitate comfortable pedestrian movement and accessibility. We wanted that to be accessible for all, and we didn't want to undermine the impact that planters could provide through their planting. Next, please. Time wasn't on our side, so we wanted an approach that could be constructed relatively easily and that would give us the ability to adapt and respond, to move things around if needed. The images illustrate the phenolic boards that we've used for base construction, the way in which these have been put together with recycled plastic base to increase longevity and prevent damp, colour differentiation to the top rim for the partially sighted, stability fixings for trees, measures to reduce the reduction in weight where we've got proximity to basements. Next, please. These images illustrate some of the ways in which the planters can be wrapped, painted, and adapted in response to engagement and different events or needs over the next 18 months. The system provides considerable flexibility with scope for application of natural materials such as willow, hazel, rattan, or the addition of things like bug hotels. We're very keen to promote biodiversity within the street. Clearly, introducing green infrastructure and nature is an important component of the scheme. Next, please, Kat. And in recognition of a growing body of evidence that simply being in, touching, or viewing nature makes people feel good, less anxious, and less stressed is an important part of our recovery. Next slide, please. We want to create variety across the seasons. This slide illustrates the diversity we're looking to capture with planting as we move through those seasons. This might be autumn. As Scott said, spring will bring a new beginning. These before and after axonometrics that I'm just about to put up, Kat, if you could put the next one on, which Scott showed, are looking south along Regent Street. And these give a sense of the change that will be experienced once the installation has been completed. The environmental messaging it will imbue, and the comparative ease with which pedestrians will be able to move along or across the street. That reduction in width is really important. Next slide, please. This is another slide that Scott showed with the relatively impenetrable barriers in place. And then the next slide, which again Scott showed, shows how their replacement within an evident, extended and protected pavement, which is a temporary pavement with the existing asphalt protected, temporary curb, and then infill that can be recycled. The associated planting and places to dwell will present a more optimistic environment and will help to encourage pedestrians back into the West End. Next slide, please. This view shows the view past Princess Street towards All Souls Church and Langham Place in late September. And then the next slide shows the way in which the proposals will help to improve the pedestrian and retail environment in a section of street between Apple and Oxford Circus. The next slide, please. Whilst the impact of this programme will be significant, it's important to recognise that it is only an experimental scheme with an 18-month life. As such, the scheme has been designed on the basis that materials be reused or recycled in a variety of ways. This process will include the relocation of plants and trees, the shredding and repurposing of the phenolic timber, and the resiting of bug hotels, potentially on roofs. Data will be collected throughout the period of the scheme, and this information will be used in development of more permanent solutions that will help us to ensure the long-term success of this wonderful street. Not everything will work. There'll be adjustments that we make along the way, but we will learn some valuable lessons. If you could go to the next slide. Here we see some photographs of the emerging scheme, with planting adding visual amenity, helping to integrate new materials and allowing people to dwell in the street. The next slide shows how the scheme is providing more space for active travel, how planting can provide a degree of protection and space for people waiting within the street. That's very important when we're trying not to crowd within buildings. The next slide shows how planting is providing a degree of protection from vehicle overrun, and how the extended pavements and the associated reduction in pavement width is making it easier for people to cross the street. And that takes some of the pressure away from junctions. And then finally, as Scott said, it's important to acknowledge that this project would not have happened without a high level of commitment and collaboration from a large number of different people and different organisations. Extensive out of hours working, the streets were busy during the day, and a shared vision, leadership and energy from the Crown Estate, particularly Westminster City Council, TfL, NWEC and Heart of London. Thank you, Peter.
I do apologise, I was muted. Yes, thank you very much, Nick. Next, we've got Sarah Rye, who's Head of Public Realm, City of Westminster, who will tell us more about the wider borough place strategy. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me along to speak. And as Peter said, we've already heard quite a lot from Scott and Nick about the detail of the specific Regent Street scheme. So I thought it would be useful just to set it into some context about the wider movement strategy, as we've termed it in Westminster, as our response to COVID, and actually sort of set out the wider programme that we undertook, which led to the evolution, as Scott mentioned, to the development of the Regent Street scheme in specifically. If you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I say, the movement strategy was developed within Westminster as a response to COVID-19. As we came out of the first lockdown, we knew there was going to be a need to support people to be able to move around in a socially distanced manner and to travel around the city, and also to support businesses. So we were particularly looking, as I say, at supporting social distancing, people being able to move around with 2 meters distance between them, and supporting sustainable and active travel such as walking and cycling, as use of public transport was obviously limited, and there was also the need to support business, both non-essential retail and hospitality businesses, to ensure that the reawakening of the city could be supported. This obviously also needs to be balanced against businesses having to start up again, who are going to want to receive their goods and services. Taxis and PHVs still needed to move around the city, and obviously the local residents and their requirements to move around. As always in Westminster, it's always a balancing job. There's an awful lot of pressures and demands for our streets and our public realm, and this has just sort of changed the pressures and the emphasis on how we need to look at the streets. And I think it's interesting to point out that particularly at this time, coming out of lockdown and the different way of moving around, it has put additional pressure and uses on our public realm. People are now sort of having to socialise outside much more and need much more space to do it. So that was, we have the need to kind of look at how we rebalance our space to react to the situation that we're in at the moment. And as I say, as a consequence of that, this is the movement strategy that we evolved. If you could go on to the next slide, please. So again, I think as Scott mentioned earlier on, we're kind of learning on the job as far as this one. None of us have been in this situation before. So we realised early on in the first lockdown in March that we were going to have to do something going forward. We had half an eye to what was going on abroad, where some of our counterparts in Spain and other parts of Europe were coming out of lockdown a little bit earlier. So we took some guidance from some of the things that they were doing, and then looked specifically our situation within Westminster. On this slide here are the sort of the key areas that we chose to focus on to provide support. So it's particularly around transport hubs, where we were anticipating sort of a rise in the number of people, and we obviously get crowds of people around transport hubs, and they were going to need more space to move around. We wanted to support key strategic walking routes to and from business centres. There was a need to support high streets and town centres, as has already been explained by Scott and Nick, to support businesses coming through through the current pandemic and the situation that we're in. We also had a focus on schools, so that school children with parents could get to and from schools safely in a socially distanced manner. And we've had a whole series of school streets developed. We also, obviously, as I mentioned earlier on about our pressure on the public realm, recognise the significance of the open spaces and parks within Westminster, and looked at how we could make changes there to support the situation. And then obviously all other sort of key commercial areas as well. So these were the kind of the priority areas that we wanted to focus on to develop our movement strategy. If you go on to the next slide, please. At a very high level, as I say, it kind of evolved as we went along, but it's basically evolved into two phases. The first half, which is termed the movement strategy, was very much focused on moving and walking around Westminster, ensuring there was enough space for people to move around in a socially distanced manner. So again, that involved a lot of our infamous green barriers, which I'll say a little bit more about later on as well, to support footway widening, and also the introduction of cycle lanes from that perspective. And it's also emphasising this was only ever a temporary measure. This first phase was a temporary measure introduced for 3 months, which was evaluated and came to an end in August, of which the majority of it was removed, which I can speak about in a moment. But again, that was the temporary initial response to coming out of the first stage of lockdown. Our approach then evolved, particularly around support of the hospitality schemes, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and the provision of space outdoor within the public realm to support outdoor dining, which under government regulations is, where most people can or could, depending on which tier we're in and what the situation is. As you say, it's a constantly evolving situation. But we developed our hospitality programme to support outdoor dining in areas like Covent Garden and Chinatown, and also up in high street areas like St John's Wood. I'm not going to say any more about that. That's probably a breakfast seminar in its own right. From that perspective, but we've learned a lot from those schemes as well. So I'll sort of focus more on the movement strategy. If you can go to the next slide, please. Quite a busy map, I appreciate, for everyone to sort of see from that perspective, but it was just to give you a scale and to set it in some context, because obviously this morning's been very focused specifically on Regent Street, but this just gives you a sense of scale. From the phase 1 of our movement strategy, that we implemented schemes across the entire borough to support businesses, residents, and visitors to the city across the whole piece. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but the green ones are more supporting pedestrians, and the blue ones at a high level are the cycle network that we implemented. If you go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So it's just sort of some high level stats from it. So as I say, we supported 14 cycle routes, which was over 20 kilometres of cycle lane were introduced. These are temporary cycle lanes. Some of them are within bus lanes, and most of them are signs and sort of painted lines on the ground. They have stayed in place, as I mentioned earlier. This first phase was actually only meant to run from sort of June till August. The cycle lanes have stayed in place. We are currently reviewing them to decide whether they do get removed, whether we retain them, because they were all implemented, as Scott mentioned earlier, under short-term temporary traffic orders, whether they're retained for that 18-month period or whether we make some of them permanent going forward, which again would be an amazing legacy of going through this process. The other two sort of key areas were actually sort of focused on footway widening and the support of non-essential retail in the first phase. What's quite interesting, particularly a lot of the key high streets up in St John's Wood or out in Pimlico, we first introduced them as footway widening schemes to support queuing outside shopping centre, outside sort of supermarkets, and as I say, non-essential retail. They've actually evolved into hospitality schemes and the support of outdoor dining. With regard to the footway schemes, the vast majority of those were actually removed at the end of August, because the numbers coming back to the city hadn't been as high as kind of we'd initially expected. So a lot of the barriers removed, apart from the ones sort of right in the West End where visitor numbers and people using the area were still high, and there was still a need to provide some support, which is kind of where we then evolve onto the development of the Regent Street scheme. If you go on to the next slide, please, thank you. And as Nick certainly mentioned in a bit more detail, the need to move on from the temporary phase that the council implemented with the green barriers was obviously essential. They were only meant to be there for 3 months, and as we're all aware, they're not the most attractive things in the world, particularly for the centre of Westminster, and they do have some limitations, particularly around accessibility for people to be able to cross the street and access to the curbside for buses and delivery waste and taxis. So that wasn't a medium-term sustainable solution, which is why we were absolutely delighted when we when we were working in partnership with the Crown and everyone else that's been mentioned for the delivery of the Regent Street scheme that we've heard a lot more about already this morning. I just, you know, it's a very unusual scheme for us to deliver something at this pace. We've all learnt a lot through the current last few months at what can be achieved in partnership. I think there's some real unique opportunities here with the scheme in Regent Street. As has already been mentioned, it's been implemented under a temporary traffic order, so it's a kind of temporary scheme. It gives us the ability to trial solutions, which is obviously not our normal direction of travel. Public engagement, okay, 2 seconds. We've not done the normal level of public engagement, but that can go on while we move forward towards a future public realm scheme. And I just want to emphasise again, I know it's been a theme all the way through, the collaboration that's been required to deliver this project has been absolutely immense, and the support from everyone to get things delivered has been phenomenal. I just hope that we can take some of that forward into future schemes. And just on the last slide, it's just drawing on the positives from this year. It is a once-in-a-life opportunity to rethink how our streets and public realm spaces in the heart of the West End can be going forward. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Sarah, and yeah, congratulations for everyone who's delivered such a major project so quickly. So now we're going to have a panel discussion and respond to the questions from the audience. So please do use the Q&A tab on the screen. I can see there are plenty of them there at the moment. But first of all, we've got two panelists who I'd like to introduce. First is Jace Tyrrell, who is Chief Executive, New West End Company, and Henriette Vanberg, who's Partner and Managing Director, CPH at Gale Architects. And first of all, I'll start with you, Jace, if I could. NWEC have obviously been involved in this project. So can you tell us a bit how you're working with local retailers and businesses to support a more resilient West End?
Good morning, Peter and everyone. And I am here on Regent Street. It is open for Christmas shopping as well, I should say that, with the beautiful new planters. So please come and support it in the last week before Christmas. Look, we're a business improvement district for those listening that aren't familiar with New West End Company, and we're a neighbouring business improvement district with Heart of London Business Alliance. Between us, both the bids in central London, we're a property bid and an occupier bid. We represent about 300 property owners and 700 businesses, so restaurants, retailers, hoteliers. So this collaboration that everyone has spoken about this morning is critical, not least getting through the pandemic this year, but going into our recovery. and it's going to be almighty recovery for the West End. And what's really terrific about this project is the pace and speed of this, as Sarah and Scott have said, because actually we all know, working on various public realm schemes in the West End, where you haven't got single ownership, you've got to bring all the interests together. These projects take time. You know, think about Oxford Street, think about Bond Street. It took us 7 years from initial conception right through to delivery last year. And Publica have been terrific, actually, you know, working on various projects, trying to knit all this together. I know a familiar person on your panels, Peter, Lucy Musgrave and the team at Publica. So look, I think what Regent Street hopefully will deliver is this requirement for a completely new consumer and customer of the West End in the future. So whether you're coming to shop, whether you're coming back to work, whether it's 3 days or 5 days, whether you're a tourist from Sydney, from Shanghai, you know, we've got to repurpose the West End experience, and we've got to create an environment that's dominated by the pedestrian. And that has to be the direction of travel. We have 2 big goals for 25. We're launching our business plan in January. Number 1, we want to be the first zero emission traffic zone in the centre of London, in the UK, and that is going to be an almighty collaboration with the City Council, TfL, and businesses to get there. We've had some good pilot projects in Bond Street and Mayfair on this journey. And second, we want to get back to 10 billion turnover. And we're going to see probably 30% of the ground floor change in the West End in the next year. So that's going to require huge collaboration, again, with the council, with our property owners, our businesses, our residential community, hugely important to the future of the West End, and the bids. So really, I'll pause there. We haven't been hugely involved in this capital program on Regent Street, but what we are looking forward is using this as an exemplar for other parts of the West End that need to get to the Regent Street standard, so everyone benefits in the future as well.
Very good. Well, you must like the fact that this has been delivered so quickly. It's taken 50 years to get round to doing anything on Oxford Street, hasn't it? So,
Old Crossrail, Peter. We could talk about that for a long time as well.
good to know, Henriette. Perhaps I could ask you. I mean, Gail were involved in public space schemes back in the early noughties, 15, 20 years ago. How much progress do you think we've done, and compare it to some of your international perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thank you so much for the invitation to join on this panel. It's great to see I'm the only outsider, so it's much appreciated. We worked with Transport for London and Central London Partnership in 2003, where we evaluated the public space quality and also measured public life and how streets were used, and also the squares, and put it together in a report that was called Towards a Fine City for People. And honestly, I think we were quite surprised about, some of the findings that we found at the time, that it was pretty rutty, could you say that? That there was loads of guard railing in Regent Street. You had really complicated crossings, like the Penn crossing, that we haven't found anywhere else in the world, very complicated systems, and a lack of benches, so nowhere to sit, and people were sitting in the pavement, and just this whole discrepancy between the quality of the buildings and the space, the economic value of it, and then the quality of the public realm that just didn't underpin it at all. So that was interesting at that time to record that. And then obviously it's 17 years ago, so a lot has happened in London since then, and the whole discussion around public realm and quality and starting to shift the paradigm of redistributing road space to more green space, but also to more people space has really shifted. And I think on that, it is striking with Scott's photo from Regent Street with the lack of people, but I think also when we look at it, the complete lack of green, and this whole notion around, we're sort of through the first crisis, but the next crisis is already going. That's the climate challenges that we've got with the whole stuff around how do we deal with cloudburst, how do we deal with rising temperatures, where London is slowly moving to Morocco. And that might sound compelling, but maybe not in the long run. So how do we actually address all of this, and how do our places have to change to provide mitigate the heat island effect and deal with cloud bursts. So a number of cities are working with that. And we've been working in Sydney for a long time, where the main street is being transformed. So that's George Street. They've taken the first 1.3 kilometers and pedestrianized it with the light rail in the middle. And now they're extending it for the last part to be a total of 2.2 kilometers. So that's a huge transformation of the city center. We're working with Park Avenue in New York that is also being readdressed and rethought around, again, the discrepancy between the quality of the public realm and the quality and economic value of the buildings. And then obviously Paris, that is pedaling into the future, looking at percentage of green space, also looking at permeable surfaces and how to look at open space as a valuable resource, and that we need to get more out of it than just moving vehicles. So that's being looked at globally.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Now we've got quite a few questions here in the Q&A panel. So let's just go through them. And the first one is about cycling. There are a few more about that. So I'll just pick up a number of them, and then not quite sure who would want to respond to that. But will the cycle lane be segregated? It's a very hostile road with heavy traffic. Was a segregated cycle lane considered for the scheme? It looks very poor for cyclists on the new plans. The temporary arrangement was so dangerous for those on two wheels. Have the London cycling campaign been consulted? And what about key cycling routes? So quite a lot of cycling issues there, but really I think mainly based on the fact that why not segregated lanes? So who would like to respond to that one?
I'd be happy to come in briefly on that one, Peter. Thank you. And thank you all for the questions, really good questions. We would want to do everything we possibly can for cycling in Regent Street, and clearly segregation is the gold standard. And clearly, if we had a totally blank sheet of paper and a blank check, we would probably have got close to or included segregated lanes and better provision than we've been able to for cycling. However, we have got cycle lanes on the street. We've enabled that. And one thing I would say that clearly the priority has been public safety and safe movement of people first, and then road users. And so I'm a cyclist myself in London, and I wanted to do as much as we possibly can. Hence, we have the mandatory lanes, and we have lanes for the first time on Regent Street. However, we couldn't remove the central islands in the time available. TfL would have needed to have redone all the signals and the crossings in the street to make that happen. And so, what our highways engineers have enabled is a scheme that includes for cycling as much as possible within this scheme. And clearly, it's a dialogue we continue to need to have as we move forward with whatever comes beyond the scheme in due course. And clearly, those consultees mentioned will engage with.
Wouldn't ones have been easy to put in? I mean, they're working pretty well around London as temporary installations. They wouldn't have impacted on.
It would have had to have narrowed the carriageway from beyond. Sorry, we wouldn't have been able to get the footway gains that we have actually got. So it would have been, we needed to keep the lanes within the main traffic. Otherwise, we'd have had to take more space. There would have been more space needed for in the carriageway.
Well, let's move on then to a question from Guy Bransby, who says the pace of completion is very impressive. So are there lessons that can be learned for the delivery of future public realm projects? As you know, there are a lot of places that have delivered temporary quite quickly and got quite a lot of kickback, but this seems to have been pretty well received. So what lessons do you think one would learn from that? Sarah, how about you? Because
yeah, clearly
that's
fine. I'm happy to respond to that, certainly initially, and I think there's quite a lot of answers to that. As has been the theme throughout this, collaboration has been absolutely key, and it's been really impressive, the speed at which we've been able to deliver. I think it's worth emphasising, though, that all of these schemes are temporary schemes, and as Scott said, even around the cycling, it's just a step along the route to a sort of future scheme. So I think to be able to deliver full public realm schemes at this pace is not feasible. However, it would be useful to speed the process up. I think the key element, certainly from the council's perspective, that's missing is that the sort of the comprehensive public consultation and engagement with all key stakeholders prior to delivering a scheme. And that's the key thing that's kind of, while there's been engagement, it's not been at the intensity it has previously, and that's obviously what adds to the timescale a lot going forward. And also, it takes a lot of resource to deliver at pace. You couldn't deliver multiple schemes. It's taken the whole team to be heavily focused on this on a daily basis to deliver it. So it's balancing that out against delivering a suite of projects. However, the collaboration and the speed, we've learned a lot of lessons for it, and I would like to see some of that taken forward so things could speed up in the future.
Very good. So there's a question from Peter Everston. So how do we get more boroughs to consider evergreen trees in our streets? Because those look really nice, Nick. So is this something which is becoming more acceptable, you think, to boroughs?
I think so. I mean, we had the challenge when looking at trees here, because there were views, could they all be evergreen? And clearly at this point in the year, that would be great. But then equally, there were views about, you know, could this be a boulevard of cherry trees? We had this challenge with time, where we needed to see what was available in this country for, you know, all sorts of biosecurity type reasons, etc. And so we adopted the approach of a sort of arboretum, if you like, so that we could pick the best of what was available and that would be suitable for replanting later, because these are not sacrificial trees. And we felt we wanted things that would reflect all of the seasons. So a little bit of evergreen now gives us that little bit of sense of change and strong visual impact. But equally, we want things that will start to sort of change the street and give that sign of life as we go through spring, a bit more interest in summer. So I think diversity is a good thing. And I think we see the same problem with pests and disease that come through cities like London over time. We've seen the problems, we've had it with Dutch elm, we've seen the problems with London plane. So actually a diversity of trees is probably good for our overall resilience. It enables us to deal with problems but still have a stock there, and to understand what works best in different locations. Clearly in Regent Street we have better light in some locations, we have shade in others, so we've kind of positioned trees in different places to respond to different contexts. One thing to just add in, I think Scott mentioned it in terms of the cycle lanes. One of the challenges we had with the cost constraints and timing was we weren't going to move all the street lights, signals, other infrastructure, and we need to make sure there are sight lines. So some of the tighter evergreen trees could be set back, some of the larger, broader deciduous trees could go in areas where they weren't going to conflict with light and sight lines to signals, etc. So I think there is room, but diversity is probably the route forward.
Thanks. James Bell asks, when you were developing the scheme, did the team consider losing the two central lanes rather than the outer ones to create a much wider median strip? It's an interesting one.
Yes, sorry, yes, and briefly, because clearly queuing outside retail premises means that narrows the available footway width, and so we pretty early on saw that we needed to provide the space right on the edges for that very reason. But really good question. We did consider that. Thanks.
As a quick detailed question from Dan Rinkelstein, does the resulting travel lane width allow vehicles to pass a waiting bus at a stop? If not, was that difficult to negotiate with TfL? And I've heard complaints about that from other road changes recently. Actually, was that something? I guess that's Scott again, isn't it? Too.
A taxi can't pass a bus at the moment, and that's part of how the scheme has been brought forward. Traffic flows 60% of what they were pre-pandemic, and therefore the modelling shows that it works up to a level of percentage that's beyond 60%, thankfully, and therefore this works. Predominantly the users on the street are buses and taxis, and then delivery earlier in the day. But as time builds, traffic's are predominant users then, but they stay in line, and obviously it's a generous lane allowing cycling and those are the road users to work together, but effectively traffic does have to move in line, and we're monitoring that. That's part of our commitment to the project, is we're monitoring bus journey times and traffic movement so that we're happy and content that this is a good scheme. Interestingly, Westminster's 20-mile-an-hour zones come in at the same time, which is a great bonus because obviously it helps also to message around vehicle movements. That obviously speeds need to be kept low, particularly in such a location as this. So we've still got some work to do on the traffic because there's some tweaks still to work through with TfL, and it will be getting better as we move forward. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Perhaps it's one for you, Jace. There's a question here about Regent Street becoming more hospitality and leisure business in future, given retail is moving online, and that might be a general question about the West End. Is a sort of structure of what happens in retail space and hospitality space going to change, do you think, in the future?
Massively, and at pace. I mean, this pandemic was already accelerating trend here, this pronounced shift online, this desire to consume more sustainably. And actually, as I said, we think about 30% of what you see on the ground floor today won't be here in 18 months. And thank goodness we have a city council that's really embraced this change in terms of the use class E and those different dynamics. There's probably a bit more of a discussion around how licensing supports different uses in the area as we sort of go on that journey. But I think, there's a whole new world out there of different types of consumer brands, offers, experience. We've all talked about that. And my goodness, the West End should really be the exemplar for the world on this. And I don't think there's a boardroom around the West End that isn't talking about this at the moment. So you're going to see an almighty pace of change, which is really exciting, actually. Let's get us into next spring, summer, and the next couple of years with all the public realm and Crossrail. Come back in 5 years and you won't recognize the West End. So quite a journey to get there. And it's very hard to think about that at the moment in tier 3 and what we're going through. But we've got to have some hope for the future. And I think it's quite exciting what we're going to see in the next few years in the West End.
Thanks. So we're nearly up to time, but there's a question here from Andrew Pincus. The new scheme looks great, but what else would the panelists like to see happen looking beyond the next 18 months? So let's start with Henriette. What sort of, how do you see things progressing in terms of how cities generally develop their public space and street program as a result of the experiments from COVID-19?
Yeah. I think that definitely is worthwhile collecting the information during the trial period in terms of how it's used and what's received well and what's not received well, to be able to, adapt the final permanent scheme. I think that in terms of seeing more of, I still think, but now I'm from the radical Scandinavia, and I still think, that more could happen in terms of in the future Regent Street, where we could have a more pedestrianised street in London as a major retail, and I think Regent Street could be a good suggestion for that. I think also we can think more about maybe in the shorter term around the cycling. I think it's a good point in terms of how that can be made attractive in terms of getting people around. And also how we avoid this kind of start-stop culture of all the different traffic signals, and how we really allow the more free flows of pedestrians to mingle and go to shops. And the F&B is rising, as I think Jace would agree with. What's the space available for food and beverage to happen? How can we spend more time outside, which is part of the shopping experience. So the shopping experience is moving away from just being walking and going into the shop. It's a lot of other stuff as well. And how do we offer best possible space for that?
Great, thank you. Right, now very quickly, let's go around asking what one thing would you like to see happen coming out of this? Let's start with you, Nick.
I would like to see more places for people to linger and spend time to connect with the buildings adjacent to the street, more personalisation from those buildings, so that that threshold becomes much richer.
Sarah, how about you?
On a similar vein, really, it's the reallocation of that public realm space towards the person and away from traffic to get that balance, particularly in the centre of Westminster.
Jace?
Two things I'm greedy. Smart city, I want to see that right across the district and really used across all elements, sustainability, customers, data and intelligence and all this work. But my second one, I'd like to see some customers back in the West End, which I hope will be next year.
Very good. And Scott, finally.
And two things, and Jace took the digital one, so I'll add two other things. I want people to feel great when they're in the street. I want people to feel like they're having an incredibly worthwhile experience and they're actually being able to enjoy the space, but also to appreciate more fully the architecture and the place and the destination that we have, because it is incredible, but we get so crowded out by traffic and other things. Let's create space for people to really celebrate and enjoy that. And that's what I'd look to be doing. So 2022 onwards, in partnership with colleagues here. Thanks for this session, Peter.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. It's a very appropriate one to have as our last event before Christmas. And I hope that the changes that you've made have a real impact on people's experience of Regent Street, not just up to Christmas, but in the next year. And I hope that the research produces positive results, which means that you can get on, deliver a much better and a more people-focused Regent Street in the years to come. So thank you all very much, and season's greetings to everyone. Thank you all for attending.